The first rays of sunlight barely pierced through the frost-covered window of David Mitchell's small bedroom. The 8-year-old boy had been awake for a while, curled up under 3 thin blankets, listening to the familiar sounds of his mother getting ready for another long, exhausting day at work. "David, sweetheart, time to get up," Linda Mitchell called softly, pushing open the creaky wooden door. She was already dressed in her blue diner uniform, her blonde hair neatly tied back in a ponytail. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed yet another sleepless night. David peeked out from under the covers, his breath visible in the cold morning air. "Mom, is the heater working today?" Linda's face fell slightly, but she forced a reassuring smile. "Not yet, sweetheart, but Mr. Johnson promised he'd come take a look this week." She sat on the edge of his bed, gently running her fingers through his messy brown hair. "I made some hot chocolate for you, the real kind, not the powdered stuff." David's eyes lit up. "Really? But that's expensive." "Mrs. Henderson left me a little extra tip yesterday. Sometimes, good things happen when you least expect them." Linda picked up a purple knitted beanie from the nightstand and carefully placed it on her son's head. "Grandpa's special hat will keep you warm until the heater gets fixed." David touched the soft wool with reverence. Every stitch carried memories of his grandfather, George, who used to sit in his favorite armchair, knitting and telling stories about his childhood. But that was before cancer took him away just 3 months ago. This beanie was the last thing Grandpa ever made, finishing it just days before he had to go to the hospital for the last time. David's voice was small. "Mom, do you think Grandpa can see us from heaven?" Linda blinked back tears. "Of course he can, baby. He's watching over us every single day." She stood up quickly, straightening her uniform. "Now come on. Let's get some breakfast in you before Mrs. Watson picks you up for school." The early morning light barely crept through the frost-covered window of the small apartment, casting a dim glow over the tiny kitchen where 8-year-old David Mitchell sat at their wobbly wooden table, his hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of hot chocolate, trying to absorb whatever warmth he could. The heater had been broken for weeks now, and though his mother kept promising that Mr. Johnson, the landlord, would fix it soon, David wasn't sure he believed it anymore. The cold wasn't the worst part, though. It was the silence. Through the thin walls, he heard the familiar creak of his father's wheelchair rolling across the floor, followed by a low, muffled groan of pain. The sound made David's stomach twist. He looked up at his mother, Linda, who was washing dishes at the sink. Her blonde hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, but the dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "Dad's hurting again," David whispered, starting to push his chair back. Linda glanced over her shoulder, then shook her head. "Finish your breakfast. Honey, I'll help him." David hesitated, but slowly sat back down, staring into his mug. The rich scent of real cocoa should have made him happy, but instead, all he could feel was a deep, aching sadness. It hadn't always been like this. Before the accident, his dad had been larger than life, strong, full of energy, and always smiling. He used to toss David onto his shoulders and run around the yard, calling him his little pilot. They would spend weekends at the park, playing catch until the sun dipped below the trees. His dad had been his hero, but ever since that terrible day, the day when the scaffolding collapsed at the construction site, sending his father plummeting 30 feet, everything had changed. Now, his dad barely left his bedroom. Pain and frustration had wrapped around him like a chain, holding him captive as much as the wheelchair did. David missed him. He missed the booming laughter that used to fill their tiny apartment. He missed the way his dad would ruffle his hair and call him champ. He missed the warm, safe feeling of being lifted into the air and spun around. Hearing his dad say, "Hold on tight, buddy," But now? Now his dad barely spoke, and when he did, his voice was different, tired, hollow, distant. David swallowed hard, gripping his mug tighter. He wanted to help, more than anything. He wanted to do something, anything, to make things better. But what could an 8-year-old boy possibly do? He had no idea that before the day was over, he would get his chance. That afternoon, as the school bell rang and students poured out of the front doors, David walked with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, lost in thought. Around him, the air buzzed with excitement. Groups of kids huddled together, chatting excitedly, their voices overlapping in an energetic hum. "President Trump is coming to town today," one boy exclaimed, practically bouncing on his heels. "Yeah, my dad said he's giving a big speech at the square," another chimed in. "I heard the news cameras are everywhere. The whole town's gonna be on TV." David's head snapped up at that. The president? He turned his gaze toward the town square, just a few blocks away. Even from here, he could see the tops of red, white, and blue banners fluttering in the cold afternoon breeze. A wave of nervous energy rolled through him. If the president was here, wouldn't this be the perfect chance? He thought about his dad, how he winced every time he moved, how he rarely even looked up when David walked into the room anymore. He thought about his mom, how she forced a smile every morning, even though she came home every night with aching feet, cracked hands, and a weight on her shoulders that David was too young to fully understand. And he thought about the unpaid bills, the whispered phone calls his mother made late at night, the way she scraped together just enough money for his father's medicine each month. If I could meet the president, maybe he could help Dad? The thought planted itself in his mind, and once it did, it wouldn't let go. An idea sparked, a wild, ridiculous, impossible idea. His fingers instinctively curled around the soft wool of the purple beanie hidden inside his coat pocket. His grandfather's beanie, the last thing Grandpa had ever made. He still remembered the day Grandpa gave it to him, sitting in his favorite armchair, his hands slow but steady as he placed the finished beanie onto David's head. "A little something to keep you warm, kiddo. But remember, what really keeps you warm is love." David blinked hard, swallowing against the lump in his throat. When you give away something you love the most, sometimes a miracle happens. That's what Grandpa had always said. He stared at the town square again, the streets crowded with hundreds, maybe thousands, of people. Could he really do this? Would the president even see him? Would anyone? His fingers clenched around the beanie inside his pocket. Should I keep it? A part of him wanted to. It was the last thing he had of Grandpa. But then, another thought pushed its way forward. If trading it meant giving his dad a chance at a better life, wouldn't Grandpa be proud? David took a shaky breath. He had made his decision. He turned, his legs carrying him away from the usual path home, away from the familiar streets that led to his mother's diner, toward the town square. As he got closer, the sheer size of the event nearly overwhelmed him. The streets were packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, waving small American flags, chattering excitedly. There were police officers stationed at every corner, their eyes scanning the crowd. Massive speakers were set up near the grandstand, and above it, a huge screen displayed the stage where the president would soon appear. David's heart pounded harder. He was just a kid, a small, poor kid in an old coat and worn-out sneakers. Why would anyone notice him? He hesitated, suddenly aware of how tiny he was compared to the wall of adults around him. What was he thinking? Maybe this was stupid. Maybe this was impossible. Then he looked down at his faded, scuffed-up shoes. He thought about his mom washing dishes long after her shift should have ended. He thought about his dad staring out the window, silent and distant, as if the world had already forgotten him. No, he couldn't give up. Taking a deep breath, David squared his shoulders and pushed forward. He would find a way. Somehow, some way, he would get to the front. The crowd was deafening, the cheers and applause filling every inch of the town square as President Trump finished his speech. He waved to the sea of supporters, turning toward the steps that would lead him off the stage. This was David's only chance. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. His small fingers clenched around the beanie inside his coat pocket, the soft wool slightly damp from his sweaty palms. Doubt gnawed at him. What if he doesn't hear me? What if nobody notices? What if they just push me aside? For a moment, he nearly let fear win. But then he thought of his dad, slumped in his wheelchair, staring at the floor with that same lost, defeated look. He thought of his mom, exhausted but smiling through her pain, working late into the night just to keep food on the table. No, he had to do this. David squared his shoulders, took a deep breath, and shouted as loud as he could, "Mr. President." His voice was barely a whisper against the roaring crowd. For a split second, he thought it had been swallowed up entirely. But then, Trump stopped. The president's head turned slightly, his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd. At first, they skimmed over the rows of waving flags, the people cheering and clapping, until they landed on him, a small boy, barely visible in the sea of adults, standing alone with trembling hands and a determined expression. The noise in the square began to fade as confusion rippled through the crowd. Why had the president stopped? Why was he staring at a child? Secret Service agents immediately stiffened, their earpieces buzzing as they assessed the situation. One of them stepped forward, ready to usher Trump along. This wasn't part of the plan, but Trump raised a hand, silencing them. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward toward David. A hush spread over the square, people whispering among themselves. Reporters raised their cameras, sensing something incredible was happening. David's breath hitched. His hands shook as he pulled the purple beanie from his pocket. For a moment, he hesitated, but then he looked up at Trump, the leader of the country, standing just feet away, waiting for him to speak. He swallowed hard and held out the beanie. "My grandpa knitted this hat before he passed away from cancer," he said, his voice unsteady but clear. "He told me it keeps love close to your thoughts, and I think you need love, too." The entire square seemed to hold its breath. The cold December wind cut through the air, but no one seemed to feel it anymore. Trump's gaze flickered, moving from David's face to the small, worn beanie in the boy's outstretched hands. Slowly, he knelt down. The president reached forward and took the beanie, turning it over in his hands as if he could feel every stitch, every loop of yarn woven with love. There was something different in his face, a rare moment of quiet reflection. For years, people had seen him as a powerful businessman, a political force, a man always ready for battle. But now, in this moment, all of that faded. He wasn't looking at cameras. He wasn't thinking about politics. He was just a man, holding a child's gift, seeing something he hadn't expected to see. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than before. "Tell me, son, what's happening with your family?" David's throat tightened. His small fingers curled into his coat sleeves as he fought back the lump in his throat. This was it, his one chance. Taking a shaky breath, he looked straight into the president's eyes and began to speak. He told Trump about his father, the strong, loving man who had once carried him on his shoulders, who had worked tirelessly to give his family a good life. And then, one day, everything changed. His mother's face had gone pale when she got the call from the hospital. David remembered it vividly. The spoon in her hand slipped, clattering onto the floor, but she didn't pick it up. The hospital had told her there had been an accident at the construction site. David's voice wavered as he described the first time he saw his father in that hospital bed, motionless, hooked up to beeping machines, his strong hands lying limp at his sides. And then came the worst part. The doctors said there's a surgery that might help him walk again, but it's too expensive. My mom works day and night. I hear her crying at night when she thinks I'm asleep, but she still smiles in the morning. So I don't worry." David dropped his gaze, staring at his small hands as they clenched tightly in his lap. "But I know she's exhausted. I know she's scared that one day she won't be able to keep going." A tear threatened to escape, but David quickly blinked it back. He took another deep breath, lifting his head once more. His wide brown eyes shone with something fierce, a small flicker of hope. "Mr. Trump, I don't know how to help my mom." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I only have this hat." But this time, as he held up the beanie, his voice didn't shake. "My grandpa made it before he passed away from cancer. He told me it keeps love close to your thoughts. And I think you need love, too." Silence. Pure, absolute silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The town square, once alive with cheers and celebration, stood completely still. Even the wind had quieted. And in the center of it all, a child. A beanie. And a moment that would change everything. For a long moment, Trump didn't speak. He stood there, holding the purple beanie in his hands, running his fingers over the soft wool, feeling the careful stitching, the warmth that had been woven into every loop of yarn. It wasn't just a hat. It was love. The cameras were still rolling. The entire country was watching. But for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the cameras. In his sharp, commanding eyes, something had changed. A rare softness had settled in, a flicker of something raw, something deeply human, something not many had ever seen in him before. He let out a slow breath, then looked down at David. The boy stood there, small but unwavering, his little hands clenched into fists at his sides, his eyes wide with a silent kind of courage. Trump crouched to David's level, meeting his gaze. "You have given me something priceless," he said, his deep voice quieter now, almost reverent. He reached out, gently placing his hand on David's small shoulder. "Now, let me return the favor." Then, turning to his aide, Trump's voice regained its signature authority, strong and absolute. "Bring me my personal checkbook." There was a brief moment of confusion among his staff. This wasn't planned. This wasn't rehearsed. But no one questioned him. One of his assistants hurried forward, pressing a sleek, black leather-bound checkbook into his hands. The hush over the crowd deepened. Even the reporters, so accustomed to political theatrics, held their breaths, sensing this was something real. Trump pulled a gold pin from the inner pocket of his coat, flipped open the checkbook, and without hesitation, scrawled his signature across a check. People strained to see the amount. Whispers rippled through the audience. And then, Trump turned back, knelt before David once more, and placed the check into his small hands. $50,000. David's tiny fingers trembled as he stared at the numbers. His breath hitched. His mother, Linda, who had been standing frozen in place, suddenly gasped, a choked, broken sound of pure disbelief. "This is for your father's surgery," Trump said firmly. "For your mother to finally get some rest, so that you don't have to worry about things that an 8-year-old boy should never have to worry about." Linda let out a sob. She ran forward, dropping to her knees beside her son, pulling him into her arms, holding him so tight it was as if she never wanted to let go. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, soaking into David's jacket. Her shoulders trembled. David was still too stunned to cry. He just sat there, feeling the warmth of his mother's embrace, the way her hands clutched at him as if she was afraid this was all a dream. But Trump wasn't finished. He slowly rose to his feet, standing tall once more. and turned to the crowd. When he spoke again, his voice wasn't the polished tone of a politician giving a campaign speech. It was something deeper. "I'm not just helping this family," he declared, his words echoing across the silent square. "I'm going to help all the families like them." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mothers clasped their hands over their mouths. Fathers tightened their arms around their children. Strangers turned to one another, eyes wide with astonishment. "I will establish a charity, the George Mitchell Foundation, to help families struggling with illness and tragedy. No one should have to go through this alone." The town square erupted. A roar of applause and cheers thundered through the air, so loud that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Linda buried her face in her son's hair, crying harder now, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. David's head spun. He couldn't believe what was happening. This was real. The moment still wasn't over. Trump looked down at the beanie in his hands one last time, the little hat that had started all of this. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted it and placed it on his own head. The crowd went wild. Camera shutters clicked frantically. People clapped, whistled, and cheered with everything they had. A grown man in the front row wiped tears from his eyes. And then, with the entire world watching, Trump made a final vow. "From now on, every time I wear this hat in an official meeting, I will donate more to the foundation." No one in the crowd could hold back their tears. Photographers lowered their cameras, forgetting to take pictures. Security personnel stood motionless, knowing they had just witnessed something far greater than politics. And David, a boy who had walked to the square that afternoon with nothing but a knitted beanie and a desperate hope, stood there, feeling the weight of a true miracle, because love always finds its way back. 3 months had passed since that life-changing day. The harsh grip of winter had loosened, making way for the gentle warmth of early spring. The Mitchells' small apartment no longer felt cold and lifeless. But it wasn't just because the heater had finally been repaired. Something far greater had changed. Hope had returned. A miracle had taken root in their home, one that was growing stronger each day. David's father, Jim Mitchell, had undergone the surgery that once seemed like an impossible dream. The doctors at Mayo Clinic had done their part, but now, the hardest journey lay ahead, learning to walk again. The first few weeks were brutal. Jim's muscles had weakened after months in the wheelchair, and every movement felt like fire running through his legs. There were days when frustration took over, when he slammed his fists against the armrests of his chair, breathing heavily through clenched teeth. But he never gave up. Every morning, before the sun had even risen, he sat on the edge of his bed, willing himself to stand. Every afternoon, he gritted his teeth through physical therapy, sweat dripping down his temples. And every evening, when exhaustion weighed on him like an anchor, he would look at David, his little boy, sitting nearby, watching him with unwavering faith in his eyes. David believed in him, and so Jim had to believe in himself. One evening, as David sat cross-legged on the floor, watching his father practice shifting his weight, something happened. Jim's left foot twitched. It was barely noticeable, just the smallest movement, but David's sharp eyes caught it instantly. His heart leaped. "Dad, Dad, you moved your foot." Jim looked down at his leg, blinking in disbelief. He concentrated, willing his body to listen to him. And then, it happened again. A small but undeniable movement. Linda, who had been folding laundry in the kitchen, turned at the sound of her son's excited voice. When she saw what was happening, the clothes slipped from her hands and onto the floor. "Jim," she whispered. Her voice trembled. Jim clenched his jaw, took a deep breath, and moved his foot again. Linda gasped, her hands flying up to cover her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. David jumped to his feet, clapping wildly. Dad, you did it. Dad, you're moving your leg. A slow, shaky chuckle escaped Jim's lips. It was the first genuine laugh he had let out in months. It's just a small step, buddy, he said, though his voice was thick with emotion. David beamed up at him, eyes sparkling with joy. But it's the first step, Dad, and there will be so many more. Linda wiped the tears from her cheeks, crossing the room in a heartbeat. She knelt beside Jim and threw her arms around him, holding on tightly, as if she could somehow pour all her love and strength into him. Jim let out a shaky breath, leaning into her embrace. For the first time in months, he felt like himself again. For the first time in months, he dared to believe in a future where he would stand tall again. And David, his sweet, strong little boy, had never doubted it for a second. One afternoon, as David returned home from school, his mother was standing at the door, holding a package in her hands. David, you have a special gift from Washington. David's eyes widened, his heart pounding in his chest. He dropped his backpack, his hands trembling as he took the package, because in the top right corner, he saw a seal he had only ever seen on TV, the seal of the White House. His mother and father watched him closely, their eyes filled with curiosity and emotion. David took a deep breath, then carefully opened the box. As soon as the lid popped open, his mouth fell open in shock, because inside was his grandfather's purple beanie. It had come back, still intact, softer than before, and perhaps now carrying stories beyond anything he could ever imagine. David reached out, running his fingers over the familiar stitches, knowing this was the same beanie that had once rested on the forehead of the President of the United States. A neatly folded letter lay beside it. David slowly opened it, his eyes scanning each line with a mix of respect and excitement. Dear David, your grandfather's beanie has traveled with me to 12 countries, attended 15 important meetings, and every time I wore it, people would ask about it. Everyone was curious why a president would wear a purple knitted beanie, and I told them about a brave little boy who gave away his most precious possession to help his family. David, do you know what I've seen? I've seen tears in the eyes of world leaders when they heard your story. I've seen politicians pause for a moment to reflect on what truly matters. I've seen strangers come together to help people they've never met, simply because they believe in the power of love and kindness. But now, it's time for this beanie to return to you. Don't worry, I had a few more purple beanies made so I can continue wearing them and sharing your story. I want to make sure that the love your grandfather stitched into every thread keeps spreading. The George Mitchell Foundation is growing, helping more and more families. And it all started because one little boy believed in love. David, I want you to remember something. You have taught so many people an important lesson. Kindness is never small. A single act from the heart can change the world. Hold on to your beanie. David, it has completed its mission with me. Now, it's time for it to keep love close to your thoughts once again. Your friend, Donald Trump. David clenched the beanie tightly in his hands, feeling a wave of emotion swell inside him. He closed his eyes and pressed the beanie against his chest, as if he were hugging the memories, the love his grandfather had left behind. He wasn't crying because he was sad. He was crying because he was happy. His mother sat down beside him, wrapping her arms around her son, feeling the quiet tremble of his small heart as he sobbed. Your grandfather is surely very proud of you. David, his father said, his voice thick with emotion. David took a deep breath, then lifted his head, his tear-filled eyes now shining with a new determination. I will never forget this lesson. David's story didn't just change his life and his family's. It sparked a wave of kindness that spread across America. The George Mitchell Foundation helped hundreds of families whose loved ones needed surgeries, medical treatments, or simply a helping hand in times of hardship. There were children who had never heard a sound before, now hearing their parents' voices for the first time. There were single mothers who no longer had to work 3 jobs just to provide for their children. There were veterans who finally received the care they needed to help them stand again after years of struggle. And it all started with an 8-year-old boy, a purple knitted beanie, and the unwavering belief that love always finds its way back. That spring, David placed the purple beanie back on his head, feeling its familiar warmth. He smiled. He knew that no matter how vast or complicated the world might seem, there was one thing that would always find its way back: love. Because when you give with a sincere heart, love is never lost. It simply continues its journey, and in time, it returns, stronger than ever.